I want to take a moment to compare and contrast descriptive studies, correlational studies, and experimental studies. For descriptive studies, we're focused on describing the world around us, and there are a whole bunch of different ways that this can be done. The first is through case studies, which is an in-depth look at one particularly interesting case. We also have naturalistic observation, and this is basically just going out into the real world and describing what you see. And then we also have surveys and interviews, where we're asking people about their own experiences. In correlational studies, we want to see whether or not two things are related to each other. And so when we're looking at the relationship between two different items, there are a couple of things that we want to know about it. The first is that we want to characterize what type of relationship it is. So is it a positive relationship? Do two things vary together? Or is it a negative relationship? When one thing increases, does the other decrease? Another thing that we want to know is the strength of that relationship. Whether or not two things seem to be strongly correlated with each other or just weakly correlated with each other. However, while both of these types of studies can give us really important information, neither of them can say anything about causation. So no matter how related things seem to be in a correlational study, we cannot say for certainty whether one thing is causing the other thing. If we actually want to look at cause and effect, we have to do experimental studies. And we can do this by manipulating one variable while holding all of the others constant. And this way, any differences that we see, we can attribute to our manipulation. And we know this because nothing else has changed in this study. So let's look at an example to see how each of these types of studies can be used. And maybe I start off with a single observation that sometimes people listen to music while studying. And the first thing that I would want to find out is how popular this behavior really is. How many people listen to music while studying? What kinds of music do people listen to while studying? Do people listen to music while studying certain subjects but not others? And I can even do a survey and ask the music listeners themselves why they like to listen to music while they're going over their notes. And in this case, I've learned a ton about the use of music in study behaviors. But I can't really say anything conclusive about it. I know that there's this interesting effect that we see in the real world, and I can describe it all I want, but I can't say anything about whether or not this is a good behavior or a bad behavior. On the other hand, if I hadn't done this descriptive research, I probably wouldn't be able to go on to do any other kind of study because I wouldn't really know what I was looking at. I wouldn't have addressed all the really base initial questions. If I wanted to follow up that descriptive study with a correlational study, maybe I would ask people to report on how often they listen to music while studying and also their overall GPA. So let me take a moment to graph that. So here I'll put GPA on the y-axis, and here we have a 4.0 at the top, and I guess a very unfortunate 0.0 on the bottom. And then on the x-axis, I'd have how often people listen to music while studying. And once a week, and twice a week, and 5 or 6 or 7 times a week. And with this data and with this graph, I would be able to see if there was a relationship between GPA and hours of musical study time. So maybe I'd see a positive correlation. Maybe I would see something like this. And here, let's look at GPA. So here we have people who have low GPAs tending to not listen to a lot of music. And in this case, wow, people who have 4.0s, they tend to listen to music while studying a lot. And so that would be a positive correlation. Maybe we would see something that looks like this. Now it seems that people who have really incredibly low GPAs, wow, they listen to a lot of music while studying. And the people who have really high GPAs, they don't seem to listen to any music at all. And so here we would say that there's a negative correlation between GPA and number of hours that someone's listening to music while studying. It's possible that we get no relationship at all. So maybe our data points are actually all over the place. And there's absolutely no relationship between GPA and how many hours someone listens to music while they study. But as interesting as this is, and as much as it can tell us, we can't say that one of these things is causing the other thing. It's easy for us to say that somehow listening to music is what's affecting the GPA scores. But maybe it's exactly the opposite. Maybe people who are naturally good students don't really like to listen to music. Or maybe there's some kind of third variable that we don't know about that's driving all of this. And that's why we can't draw any conclusions about causations from correlational studies.
Studying the human mind is a tricky business. There's still so much we don't know, and so many questions scientists are looking to answer. But when researchers are working with human subjects, they have to balance getting answers with protecting their subjects. In the past, they haven't always been good about taking care of the fellow human beings they're studying. A lot of historical psychology experiments would be considered unethical by today's standards, and the foundation of the ethical standards we use today comes from the 1970s, when scientists came up with a list of rules to protect the security and privacy of human volunteers. It's known as the Belmont Report. Basically, 3 key ethical principles to guide all human research. The first point is called respect for persons, and it means that subjects have to give informed consent. Anyone who participates in human research, including psychological research, needs to know the risks and benefits of the experiment before signing up. The second ethical principle is called beneficence, and it basically means that researchers should try not to have any negative impact on the well-being of the people who participate in their studies. Basically, do no harm. The final point, justice, involves making sure that subjects aren't exploited. Researchers should also make sure that the burdens of the study and the benefits of the results are distributed fairly. In early research studies, for example, the subjects would often be poor, while wealthier patients would benefit from the results of the experiment. And that's not okay. These rules apply to human research in all fields, including psychology. But the code of conduct hasn't always been so clearly defined, and before it was, there were a lot of questionable studies being done. In the year 1920, a psychologist named John Watson wanted to show that humans can be classically conditioned, like what happened to Pavlov's dogs. Basically, classical conditioning means pairing a stimulus, like food, that triggers a physical response, like drooling, with an unrelated stimulus, like a bell. Even though ringing a bell, of course, wouldn't normally make dogs drool, when Pavlov paired the sound with food, he conditioned the dogs to respond to the bell by drooling. Watson and his team decided to prove that this could be done in humans by classically conditioning a 9-month-old baby named Albert using animals and scary noises. First, the researchers presented Albert with a fuzzy white rat. As he'd reach out to pet the animal, the psychologists would strike a hammer against a metal bar behind his head, creating a loud noise to startle him. Eventually, just the sight of the white rat was enough to make Albert start crying and crawl away. He'd begun to associate the fear of the loud, scary noise with the fuzzy white rat. So yeah, Albert had been conditioned. But this study failed in a lot of ways. For one thing, it used a single subject and no controls, so Watson hadn't really proved anything. But then, of course, there were the ethical issues. Watson never reconditioned Albert to not be afraid anymore, so he was permanently affected by the experiment and not in a good way. We also don't know if Albert's mother fully consented to the research, which definitely violates the main ethical principles of the Belmont Report. And this wasn't the only horrifying psychology experiment conducted on children in the early 20th century. In the late 1930s, a psychologist named Wendell Johnson and his graduate student Mary Tudor at the University of Iowa wanted to know how positive and negative feedback affected the way children learned language. They decided to test this directly by giving kids positive and negative feedback on speech disorders. That might not sound so bad, but there's a reason why their experiment is now known as the Monster Study. Tudor recruited 22 children from an orphanage, told them they'd be given speech therapy, and split them into 2 groups. 10 of these children, 5 in each group, had early signs of stutters, but both groups also included kids with normal speech patterns. The kids in one group were told that they didn't have a stutter. They were given positive feedback, that they'd outgrow the speech difficulties, and that they should ignore anyone who criticized the way they spoke. Meanwhile, those in the other group were told that they did have a stutter, and that they should never speak unless they could do it right. As you can probably imagine, this didn't go very well. The encouragement and criticism didn't seem to have much of an effect on the children's stutters, but the different kinds of feedback did have a huge impact on their self-esteem. The kids with speech issues who got positive feedback didn't lose their stutters, but they did become a lot more confident when they spoke. Meanwhile, the children who were given negative feedback became more withdrawn, self-conscious, and frustrated, whether or not they actually had a stutter to begin with. So for that group of kids, this research was pretty damaging. As minors, they couldn't consent to the research, and the people who ran the orphanage didn't protect them from the potential harm of the study. The children also also weren't debriefed after the project was over, and there was no real follow-up on how they may have been affected by the study long-term. All of these things were later declared unethical by the Belmont Report. Experiments, of course, can harm adult subjects too. In 1961, a researcher at Yale University named Stanley Milgram was interested in the psychology of obedience. He decided to see how subjects would react when a researcher pushed them to do things that went against their morals. The study he came up with is now called the Milgram experiment, and it had 3 separate roles. The experimenter, played by a scientist in a white lab coat, was the authority figure. The teacher was the role assigned to the experimental subject, and the final role was the learner, a paid actor who the subject thought was actually another volunteer. The learner was sent to a separate room so they were out of sight while the experimenter observed the teacher, the subject, instructing the learner in a word pairing task over an intercom. Every time the learner got the word pair wrong, the teacher pressed a button to shock them, with the voltage increasing by 15 volts for every wrong answer. The subject believed they were shocking the learner, but they were actually listening to an actor pretending to be in pain, complaining of chest pains, shouting, pounding on the wall, and eventually going silent. The experiment only ended when the teacher had given the maximum 450-volt shock 3 times in a row, or when they refused to continue. 65% of the subjects did give out those maximum voltage shocks, just because a scientist in a white lab coat told them to. Milgram concluded that people will obey authority figures even in morally questionable circumstances, and the experiment has since led to many more studies on the psychology of authority. But the subjects thought they were actually listening to someone being electrocuted on the other end of the line, even though they were told by the experimenter that there would be, quote, no permanent tissue damage. Leaving your subjects feeling like they may have just killed someone doesn't protect their well-being, and they couldn't have gotten informed consent, since warning participants about the experiment would have changed how they reacted. And since then, there have indeed been other studies that led people to believe they might be hearing someone get seriously injured. In 1964, a woman named Kitty Genovese was murdered. At the time, newspapers reported that there were more than 30 witnesses to the murder, and that none of them called the police. We now know that those reports were flawed, but for a while it seemed like dozens of people just stood by while someone was murdered right in front of them. So in 1968, psychologists John Darley and Bibb Latané at Columbia University came up with a way to learn more about why people might not act in a crisis, especially if there are others around. They placed college student volunteers alone in rooms, gave them headphones, and told them that the study was about the emotional issues faced by students. Each subject was told that they would be communicating with a few other students over intercom to avoid any privacy issues that might come up if they were face-to-face. But the other students on the line were actually recordings, and one of those recorded students mentioned early on in the conversation that they had occasional seizures. Later on in the experiment, that voice would start to have trouble speaking and ask for help, saying they were having a seizure. The researchers then measured how long it took the subjects to go look for help. They found that it took participants longer to respond when there were more people in the conversation. The subject was less likely to do something if they believed there were other people who could intervene instead. It's called the bystander effect. Understanding this response is important for investigating crimes and for protecting communities by teaching people to act during a crisis instead of assuming that someone else will do it. But like the Milgram experiment, there are ethical concerns about how this research might have affected the subjects after the study was over. These days, it would be tough to convince a review board that the potential benefits of this kind of study outweigh the risks. Another study turned out to be so damaging that it had to be ended early. In 1971, Philip Zimbardo, a psychology professor at Stanford University, wanted to learn more about how being placed in different social roles affected the way people behave. He decided to simulate a prison and cast volunteer subjects into the roles of guards and prisoners. 24 white male college students were recruited into the study and separated into 2 groups, prisoners and prison guards. Zimbardo acted as the prison superintendent. The prisoners were searched, then given ID numbers instead of names to dehumanize them. Meanwhile, prison guards were given uniforms and clubs and told to do whatever they had to do to maintain order, giving them power over the prisoners and a sense of superiority. The study was supposed to last for 2 weeks, but was actually called off after just 6 days because the conditions in the prison went downhill so quickly. One prisoner had to be released from the study even earlier because the conditions in the jail made him panicked and disoriented. Other prisoners started a revolt because because the guards had treated them so badly. After that, the guards became more and more abusive, giving the prisoners physical punishments when they misbehaved, like forcing them to sleep on concrete and to strip naked. In the end, Zimbardo concluded that the subjects had internalized their assigned roles. The prisoners became submissive, while the guards became aggressive and abused their power over the prisoners. You could not do this study today. By acting as the superintendent, it was impossible for Zimbardo to stay impartial. That's a pretty big flaw in the study's design. He was invested in the outcome of the research. Zimbardo also allowed the guards to subject the prisoners to serious abuse and may have caused them real permanent harm. So again, that whole well-being thing was not really taken into consideration for this study. Like the rest of the studies on this list, the Stanford prison experiment would not be considered ethical these days. But psychology's sometimes dark past has helped scientists realize that they have a responsibility to protect the public and the subjects of their research studies, which is why ethical standards are an important part of modern research. We want to understand the human mind, but in the process, we also have to protect the minds being studied. The standards laid out by the Belmont Report help us do just that.
Let's say a psychologist wanted to test whether people who are thirsty do more poorly on math tests than people who are well hydrated. She puts out an ad for participants which says that she's conducting a study of math ability that will take an hour. But when her participants turn up, she divides them into thirsty and non-thirsty groups. The non-thirsty people are each given 2 glasses of water and made to wait in a room for an hour, and then take a 20-minute test. This is a little longer than the psychologist said, but they're not too upset about it. The thirsty people, though, are forced to stay in a room without water for 5 hours before taking a 20-minute test. They're justifiably upset. The psychologist made them uncomfortably thirsty and kept them for far longer than she said. The psychologist did not conduct her experiment with adequate ethical standards. The importance of ethics in psychological research has grown as the field has evolved. Some of the most famous studies in psychology could not be conducted today because they would violate ethical standards. Philip Zimbardo designed his Stanford prison experiment to look into the causes of conflict between guards and prisoners. Zimbardo assigned some college students to play guards and others to play prisoners in a prison set up in the basement of the Stanford Psychology Building. The experiment quickly got out of hand. The guards quickly began abusing the prisoners for the sake of order. Zimbardo let this go on until his girlfriend visited the prison and was shocked at what she found. Zimbardo's experiment allowed its participants to hurt each other, both physically and psychologically, and would not be approved by today's review boards. Ethical standards in psychological research are motivated by 2 main principles: minimized harm and informed consent. The psychologists studying thirst and test performance failed on both of these counts. She made her participants unnecessarily uncomfortable and didn't tell them how long they would really be in the experiment. The experiment would likely not be approved by her university's Institutional Review Board, or IRB. The IRB is in charge of determining whether the harm done by an experiment is worth its potential value to science and whether researchers are taking all of the precautions they can to make the research experience pleasant and informative for participants. Minimized harm and informed consent underlie the entire process of designing and approving psychological research. When psychologists are designing experiments, they try to think about the least harmful way to test the hypothesis they're interested in. Harm can be physical or psychological. Deception is considered a form of psychological harm that is avoided if at all possible. If the psychologist is unable to design the experiment without any risk of harm, she must give patients a consent form to sign that clearly explains all of the risks involved in participating in the study. The psychologist conducting the thirst experiment would have to clearly explain in her consent form that the participants were likely to get uncomfortably thirsty. Psychologists who feel they need to deceive their participants run into a unique challenge with regard to consent forms. Deception is quite common in psychological research because it allows researchers to design situations in which participants are more likely to act naturally. In another famous unethical experiment, Stanley Milgram told participants that they were helping him conduct an experiment about learning. He had an actor in another room play the learner and told the participants to administer electric shocks to the learner if he got a question wrong. Milgram's experiment was actually on obedience. How long would his participants continue to listen to him and shock the learner? But if he had told them his real goals, it would clearly have affected their behavior. They would have been far less likely to be obedient if it were put in their minds that this is what Milgram was testing. There is a genuine need for deception in psychological research, but ethics now require that it be minimized. and that patients are fully informed of the deception in a debriefing session once the experiment is over. After every experiment, whether or not deception is involved, researchers will explain to their participants what they were trying to measure and allow the participants to ask any questions. A final consideration in psychological research is use of animals in experiments. Some psychologists, particularly those that study biological aspects of psychology, feel that they need to conduct experiments on animals. They might want to test a new drug or do brain research that would be clearly unethical on a human. The American Psychological Association allows research to be conducted on animals, though they require that researchers are careful to, as with their human participants, minimize harm and make sure that the harm they do is worth it for its scientific benefit. Most experiments are also now conducted on animals like rats, mice, and birds. Research on primates, like in Harry Harlow's famous experiment on love in neglected monkeys, is far more restricted. To sum things up, for the sake of ethics, psychologists are expected to make every effort to minimize harm and get informed consent from participants. Deception is allowed, but must be minimized, and participants must be informed of it after the experiment is over. Each research organization's institutional review board oversees the process of approving research. Animal research is allowed, but researchers must treat the animals with respect and dignity.